Have you ever watched the most hardened military men freeze in their tracks? Not from a weapon, not from an explosion, but from a symbol inked into someone's skin? That's exactly what happened the day Commander Reyes tried to bar a woman from entering the gates of Fort Halcyon, a classified base known for training the country's most elite operatives. They laughed at her credentials, mocked her appearance, and dismissed her presence until she rolled up her sleeve. What they saw was a tattoo unlike any they had ever encountered, a mark so feared that even generals once trained to resist pain, fear, and psychological warfare stood in stunned silence. But what few knew was that this symbol wasn't just ink. It was a legacy, a code, a scar from a chapter of history they had tried to bury. What unfolded next would dismantle every assumption about who she was, where she came from, and what she was truly capable of, and the base would never be the same again. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. They called her a civilian. At first glance, she certainly looked like one plain navy shirt, loose khaki pants, hair tucked under a faded cap, and a small canvas backpack slung casually over one shoulder. She didn't walk, like someone seeking validation. She strode across the dry gravel of the outer checkpoint, with quiet certainty, eyes scanning the compound's rigid walls and razor-lined fences like she had seen them before. And she had. Years ago, before it was renamed, before the world forgot. The sun bore down with relentless heat that morning, bouncing off the sand-colored structures and steel barricades, casting sharp shadows across the concrete perimeter where guards stood in stiff formation. When she reached the first security booth, her ID badge was met with immediate suspicion. It wasn't expired, and it wasn't forged. It simply wasn't in the system. Or rather, it had been erased. The guard barely glanced at it before shaking his head and gesturing for her to step aside. The other soldiers nearby looked up briefly, curious but unimpressed. She wasn't wearing any insignia, and her build didn't scream combat experience. But if one had been trained to look more carefully, they would have noticed the subtle gait, the way her feet landed firmly, evenly, with the control of someone who had once been trained to move like a shadow. She didn't argue, not at first. She calmly stepped to the side, took a seat on the metal bench reserved for visiting personnel, and waited. There was no anger in her face, only a quiet understanding that things needed to play out. This wasn't new to her. She had walked into buildings more hostile than this one, been ignored, patronized, and laughed out of rooms, until the moment came when she no longer had to speak to be heard. Inside the security office, Commander Reyes reviewed the surveillance footage while sipping his morning coffee. He was tall, rigid, and carried the energy of someone who had climbed the ranks not just through merit, but by ensuring no one questioned his authority. When the guard radioed in about an unregistered woman trying to bluff her way into the inner gates, Reyes didn't even blink. "Handle it," he said flatly. But something made him pull up the feed anyway. When the camera focused on her face, he paused. There was something oddly familiar, an echo of a file he once glanced at during a security clearance review years ago, but he couldn't place it. Still, it was enough for him to walk down personally and see what the fuss was about. When he arrived at the checkpoint, he didn't waste time. He demanded her name. She gave it, plainly, without inflection. He scoffed. There was no match in their database. He reminded her this was a restricted military zone, and that any unauthorized presence could lead to immediate detention. She said nothing. She simply stood and rolled up the right sleeve of her shirt, and that's when everything stopped. The sun, the wind, the distant sound of helicopter rotors, all of it seemed to go quiet. The guards leaned in. Commander Reyes took an involuntary step back. On her forearm was a symbol most of them had only seen once, buried deep in internal case files labeled Top Secret Echo Division. It was a stylized black hawk, cradling a crumbling hourglass, its wings wrapped around it like a shroud. Beneath it, in faded ink, were coordinates. And those coordinates led here, before this base ever bore its current name. Only a handful of operatives ever earned that mark. Fewer still survived long enough to have it fade. The woman standing before them wasn't just someone from the past. She was the past. The tattoo was once a direct link to Operation Silence, an off-the-books mission that allegedly never happened. Reyes had been told that entire unit was disbanded, buried under bureaucratic tape after a series of internal scandals and disappearances. But clearly, someone had survived. And she wasn't here by accident. She had come back to reclaim something. Or someone. She didn't need permission to enter the base, because long before any of them had arrived, she had helped build it from the shadows, and she wasn't asking for respect. She was here to collect on a promise that had been made in blood. They had denied her entry. Now they stood frozen in a mix of confusion and fear. And that was only the beginning. Before she was the woman whose silent presence rattled a military base to its core, she was simply known to a few as Inez Velázquez. To the outside world, the name meant nothing. No online records, no digital footprint, no government affiliation that could be easily pulled from any federal archive. But to those who had once worn classified code names stitched into the lining of their uniforms, Inez was more than a name. She was a ghost. And yet, on this morning, under the cloudless blue stretch of sky above Fort Halcyon, she looked anything but ghostly. She looked human. Just. Ordinary. And perhaps that was what made her all the more unforgettable. At 47, Inez carried the kind of calm reserved for people who had endured storms the rest of the world couldn't imagine. Her face bore no makeup, no signs of vanity, but her skin, sun-kissed and weathered at the edges, told stories of years spent in terrain far less forgiving than this dusty military outpost. Her dark eyes didn't dart around nervously. They scanned, absorbed, processed, cataloged. Every inch of her surroundings was being recorded with the precision of someone who once relied on every detail for survival. She wasn't tall, but her stature gave off the illusion of being larger than life. Not because she demanded attention, but because attention followed her as if by gravitational pull. There was nothing flashy about the way she moved or stood, and still, those who passed by her in silence felt the instinct to look twice, unsure what made them so unsettled by someone doing absolutely nothing wrong. Her hands, rough and calloused, didn't belong to someone who lived behind a desk. Her palms bore old scar tissue, some of it shaped like burns, others more surgical, remnants of procedures she had never volunteered for. Her left thumb had a slight twitch, a consequence of nerve damage sustained during a blackout mission in the forests of Quang Phai, a place no soldier talked about openly, and which didn't officially exist on any current geopolitical maps. The tattoo that now defined her entry into the base was actually the most visible piece of a much deeper history. Beneath the simple clothing she wore, her body was a canvas of encoded pain, one that whispered truths to those trained to recognize them and shouted warnings to those who didn't. But this was not a woman, built on bravado or bitterness. Inez was not here for revenge. She wasn't here to wave her past like a flag, or to prove something to anyone still breathing within the concrete walls of Fort Halcyon. She was here because a promise had been broken. A silent agreement between those who operated in the deepest shadows of military intelligence had been tossed aside like an inconvenient footnote in history. And while the government had tried to erase her file, scrub her face from the mission reports, and retire the operations that bore her name in silence, they hadn't erased her memory, or her vow. Years ago she had walked away from the world of black ops under conditions that had left even the most seasoned agents shaken. Her exit wasn't accompanied by medals or debriefings. She didn't get a handshake or retirement ceremony. She disappeared after the implosion of Echo Division, the clandestine unit once known for carrying out morally gray missions under extreme secrecy. Echo Division didn't make national headlines. It didn't have public scandals. It simply vanished after a mission went catastrophically wrong, one that Inez was never allowed to talk about, even now. But it wasn't just her silence that made her story terrifying to those who remembered her. It was the fact that she had come back. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. In her years away from the service, Inez lived in places where her name never had to mean anything. Small towns in Mexico where she fixed radios for fishing boats, villages in southern Greece where she taught children how to defend themselves using nothing but their breath and their balance. She kept no phone, no address. She took odd jobs as a translator, a wilderness medic, and once even as a disaster recovery volunteer following a mudslide in Indonesia. She wore her past like an invisible garment, always present, never flaunted. She had spent nearly 2 decades in self-imposed exile, not because she feared anyone, but because she didn't want to be found until she chose to be. And she had chosen now. Inez's decision to return wasn't driven by nostalgia. It was sparked by a code embedded in a secure frequency, a transmission that repeated the coordinates of Fort Halcyon, and a string of numbers she hadn't heard in 18 years. It was a call no one else would recognize, buried in a static pattern only an Echo operative could decipher. Someone out there had used the old language. And someone, somewhere inside this base, had either cracked that code or betrayed it. As she sat silently under the heat of the midday sun, with sweat beginning to form at the nape of her neck, she recalled the words of the man who once trained her. When your name no longer matters, your legacy is what they'll fear. She hadn't believed him then, but now, as soldiers shifted uncomfortably in her presence and command staff second-guessed everything they knew, she understood exactly what he meant. Inez Velázquez was not a name meant for paperwork. She was a storm they had buried and hoped would never return. But storms don't need permission to roll in. They just need a reason. Fort Halcyon stood like a forgotten citadel in the middle of nowhere, an angular fortress carved into the arid edge of the Nevada desert, miles from the nearest town, and even farther from the reach of civilian eyes. Its exterior offered nothing of its true purpose, a grid of reinforced concrete structures, watchtowers, and satellite dishes that disguised themselves as weather equipment. From the outside, it looked like a base frozen in time, built for wars long past, preserved only by the stubborn hum of bureaucracy. But inside its thick steel gates, Fort Halcyon pulsed with secrets. This was not a training camp. This was not a weapons depot. This was a proving ground, a crucible for strategies and tools the government didn't publicly admit existed. Beneath the main buildings, a latticework of underground labs and testing chambers operated 24/7, accessible only through biometric corridors and voice-authenticated lifts. Those who worked down there spoke in hushed tones and rarely met each other's eyes. Silence, after all, was part of the job. The desert surrounding the base was both a natural barrier and a calculated advantage. The dry, cracked earth stretched endlessly in every direction, shimmering with heat by day and chilled with silence by night. The base had been constructed in a natural depression, shielded from satellite visibility by a combination of rocky ridges and engineered camouflage. Drones circled in irregular patterns above, ensuring that even the birds learned to keep their distance. On the northern ridge, a series of surveillance towers stood, like watchful sentinels, their rotating sensors designed to pick up even the heartbeat of a coyote crossing through the sand. The terrain itself had become a character in the story of Fort Halcyon, indifferent, harsh, and brutally effective at keeping the uninvited out and the secrets in. Inside, the atmosphere was more sterile than hostile. Concrete hallways were lit by flickering LED panels that gave everything a washed-out blue hue. Every door had a scanner, every camera had infrared capability, and every step taken left a trace. Most of the personnel wore the standard tactical uniform, dust-colored fatigues, black boots polished more out of habit than necessity, and name tags that rarely matched the names in their digital files. Very few people at Fort Halcyon were who they claimed to be, and even fewer cared to ask questions. The silence wasn't enforced, it was learned. In a place like this, information was more dangerous than ammunition. Despite its size, the base was compartmentalized to an extreme degree. Low-clearance staff worked only within designated wings, and no one dared wander off track. The cafeteria had no windows. The mess hall music was soft and unremarkable. Conversations revolved around logistics, schedules, drills, never past lives, never futures. The barracks were arranged in narrow rows with just enough space for function, not comfort. The gym, though expansive, was always eerily quiet, occupied by men and women who trained like machines, fast, efficient, and detached. Every object in the facility served a purpose, and sentimentality had no place here. Even the occasional photos pinned above beds were old, dog-eared, and often hidden the moment anyone else entered the room. Fort Halcyon didn't make you forget who you were. It simply made you wish you had. There was one section, however, that even the highest-ranking officers avoided, Sub-Level 5. Officially, it was listed as an R&D archive, a data storage vault used to preserve decommissioned tech and outdated mission files. But the truth, whispered by those who had been stationed at the base long enough to collect rumors, was that Sub-Level 5 had once been home to Echo Division. Long before Fort Halcyon adopted its new identity, back when it had been known as Site 27A, Echo Division had operated from the underground chamber where walls were made of lead-lined titanium and entry required 3 separate codes spoken in a sequence that changed every 48 hours. Sub-Level 5 had since been sealed. The code panels were removed, the hallways walled off with steel plating. But even after 2 decades, the air around that corridor felt different. Colder. Still. As if something inside had never stopped waiting. In the upper levels, where command resided, the offices were slightly more modern. Screens buzzed softly behind tinted glass, and whiteboards displayed mission outlines and theoretical engagement diagrams. Commander Reyes, whose office overlooked the North Training Field, had deliberately kept his space minimal. 1 desk. 2 chairs. A file cabinet secured with a triple lock system and a wall-mounted comms unit directly linked to Defense Command in D.C. He had never served with Echo Division. He wasn't old enough, but he had read the redacted files, pieced together what little he could from the smudged notes and cryptic margins left by commanders who had disappeared shortly after signing them. He knew enough to be afraid of anything that left no digital trail. That was the strange part about Inez Velasquez. She didn't fit in with this world. And yet, she belonged here more than most of the men walking these halls in uniform. Her presence disrupted the ecosystem, like a signal broadcast in the wrong frequency, reminding everyone of a history they had sworn didn't exist. Even the air felt heavier the moment she stepped beyond the gates. Fort Halcyon was built to handle the best and train the toughest, but it wasn't built to house ghosts. And yet, here she was, a remnant of a classified legacy they had worked hard to lock away, now walking the very corridors that had been paved with her silence. The place itself remembered her. The locks clicked slower, the lights flickered longer, the system scanned her twice. As if the building recognized her presence, but couldn't quite accept it. And the base wasn't wrong. Inez Velasquez didn't come to be accepted. She came to awaken what had been buried. Because somewhere inside Fort Halcyon, behind walls that no longer bore names, lay a truth even this facility feared. One that had been inked into her skin, encrypted in her blood, and carried now not as a burden, but as a final mission. Colonel Darius Krell had a reputation that stretched far beyond Fort Halcyon's remote borders. To some, he was a war strategist, a tactical genius whose brilliance had saved countless missions in conflict zones from Sudan to the Balkans. To others, he was a hammer in search of a nail, a man who solved every problem with force, manipulation, and unrelenting control. His file was thick, with commendations and field honors, but if you sifted deeper beneath the layers of glowing reports and carefully worded citations, you'd find whispers, disappearances, broken alliances, civilians classified as, quote, collateral necessity. Krell operated with a singular philosophy. Stability required silence, and silence could always be bought or enforced. It was no surprise that men like him rose quickly in the darker corners of military infrastructure, especially in environments like Fort Halcyon, where truth and transparency were obstacles, not virtues. Krell wasn't just stationed at Halcyon, he had embedded himself into its foundations. After the base was restructured under new directives a decade ago, he was brought in to optimize performance, which in practice meant closing doors that led to inconvenient questions and rerouting every clearance system so that only he had access to the full operational scope. He gutted old departments, rewrote training protocols, and buried old divisions like Echo deeper under bureaucratic concrete. He believed in selective memory. What the institution chose to remember became the truth, and what it erased had never happened. And that made Inez Velasquez not only a ghost from the past, but a threat to everything Krell had worked to suppress. Her role had been redacted in every known version, but not before a few unfiltered data dumps were intercepted by Krell's own intelligence team. That was the first time he'd seen the hawk and hourglass tattoo. The moment he did, he ordered that any associated imagery be scrubbed from the network. Too symbolic, he claimed. Too risky. People didn't need mythology. They needed structure, and symbols were dangerous in the hands of the forgotten. Now, the symbol had returned, and it was attached to a woman who didn't ask permission to step onto his base. Krell received the alert from Reyes's security log within minutes of the incident at the gate. The report was brief, factual, and deeply unsettling. A civilian had attempted access, denied entry, and then revealed a tattoo matching the historical insignia of Echo Division. The final note from Reyes mentioned that the woman had not resisted, had not demanded entrance, and had instead waited in silence for further action, an unnerving move that reeked of confidence. That alone made Krell furious. He didn't fear confrontation, but uncertainty, ambiguity, was something he had spent years eliminating from his operational field. Now, a single person had reintroduced both into the bloodstream of his command. And worse, she hadn't said a word. By the time Krell stepped into his private command suite, a room shielded behind 3 security doors and accessible only via retinal scan, his mind was already working through containment strategies. He sat at his central console, watching the video feed from the checkpoint on loop. The image of Inez sitting calmly on the bench, her posture still, her eyes scanning without anxiety, made his jaw tighten. He leaned forward when the sleeve was rolled up, freezing the frame as the tattoo came into view. The hawk, the hourglass, and those damned coordinates. They should have meant nothing now. They should have died with the division, but clearly, something, or someone, had reawakened the code. Krell's mind went to the secure archive buried under Sublevel 5, where the last remaining Echo files were stored. Files he had deliberately never destroyed, only buried, in case they needed to be used as leverage or blackmail. Now they felt like landmines. He had hoped Echo Division would fade into memory, its members too scattered or dead to pose any threat. But Inez had returned, and that could only mean one thing. Someone had broken protocol. Someone had reached out to her. The threat wasn't just the tattoo, or the fact that she had walked onto the base without clearance. It was what she represented, an uncontrolled variable, a relic of a mission that had gone so catastrophically sideways that it had cost the Pentagon millions in damage control. Echo Division had operated with 1 foot outside legal jurisdiction. They were trained for deniable missions, ghost operations, and Krell had once argued against their methods in an off-record meeting. He had called their tactics unsustainable. That's what you say when something terrifies you, but you don't want to admit it out loud. Now Inez stood on his turf, and he had two options: suppress or contain. He couldn't expel her without drawing attention from upper echelons who still remembered Echo's contributions. He couldn't detain her without a charge that would hold up to scrutiny. But what Krell could do, what he always did best, was isolate and discredit. He would build a narrative, slowly and carefully, that painted her as unstable, as a remnant of a past riddled with ethical lapses. He would resurrect ghosts of her own, bend records where needed, feed the right suspicions to the right people, and eventually he would erase her again, only this time completely. But what Krell didn't yet know was that Inez hadn't come alone, not physically, but through time, through memory, through encrypted fragments still buried in the infrastructure of Halcyon itself. She carried stories in her veins, ones the walls hadn't forgotten. And what terrified Krell wasn't just the woman, it was the truth she carried. A truth that had the power to dismantle his carefully orchestrated control. And that truth had already begun to awaken. The routine at Fort Halcyon ran with mechanical precision, a carefully orchestrated system designed not just to train but to condition. The rising horn at 0500 hours jolted personnel awake like clockwork, and by 0515 the sound of synchronized boots echoed across the inner yard. Morning drills were not optional. They were sacred, treated with the same reverence as national protocol. Physical training, weapons handling, tactical response. Each segment of the day was plotted down to the minute, and deviation was not tolerated. Those who strayed from the rhythm of the base didn't last long. They were reassigned, reshuffled, or disappeared quietly into other sectors with less visible walls. It was this daily ritual, this unyielding pattern of control, that Colonel Krell believed was his strongest weapon. Discipline through repetition, loyalty through structure. When Inez Velasquez reappeared, it didn't immediately disrupt the visible rhythm. The drills continued, orders were barked, reports were submitted. But under the surface, something subtle began to shift. It started with the glances, the way soldiers began to watch her without admitting they were watching. She was granted temporary observer status pending verification of her identity, a bureaucratic loophole Krell reluctantly approved after pressure from Command Intelligence HQ. She was allowed inside, but only within certain zones. She accepted the constraints without protest, which unsettled Krell more than if she had challenged them. Each morning she rose before the base did, walking the perimeter trail alone with her hands behind her back, pausing at key intersections as if tracing a blueprint she'd memorized years ago. No one assigned her duties. No one briefed her. Still, she navigated Halcyon with ease, like someone returning to a childhood home repainted by strangers. Each time Krell passed her in the hallway or observed her on the monitors, she was always still, but never passive. She seemed to be listening to the building itself, paying attention to structural details no one else noticed. One afternoon, she stood silently in front of an old steel hatch near the west wing, one that had long been sealed shut after a renovation project buried sub-level 5. She rested her hand on the cold metal and simply stood there, her eyes closed, as if she could hear echoes from the other side. Krell had that feed cut moments later. No reason to let the rest of the staff see her communing with the past. It wasn't long before the whispers started. Among the younger recruits, she became the subject of speculative conversations. They called her the Revenant, the Silent Operator, Ghost Mother. No one knew her real name, but everyone noticed how officers who once barked at subordinates fell quiet when she passed. Even Reyes, Krell's loyal subordinate, had begun to shift in tone. He still reported daily, still followed orders, but his language became careful, and his eyes betrayed a brewing doubt. Krell didn't like that. He could tolerate fear. It was useful. But doubt? Doubt cracked loyalty, and loyalty was the only glue holding the truth together. To counter the slow unraveling, Krell began reinforcing his dominance through routine. He increased the tempo of drills, ordered surprise evaluations, and shuffled staff into different assignments under the guise of rotation. He requested new psychological profiles on key officers, and had analysts scan internal emails and encrypted messages for any signs of insubordination. All of this was designed to suffocate the space Inez seemed to be creating, an invisible room within the walls of Halcyon, where memory was starting to breathe again. He watched her every move, but the more he watched, the less he understood. She never pushed boundaries. She never broke rules. And yet, she was already influencing the base like a splinter in the mind. It was during the third week of her presence that a pattern emerged, one that even Krell's own data logs couldn't deny. Every day at exactly 1,800 hours, Inez walked to the west observation deck, a mostly unused section of the compound facing the boundary fence and the horizon beyond. She stood there for 17 minutes, facing the setting sun, arms crossed, gaze unwavering. 17 minutes. No more, no less. On the fourth day, a junior lieutenant followed her from a distance, attempting to catch a glimpse of what she was doing. He reported that she didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there in complete silence. But what unnerved him most was the way she turned around exactly at the 17th minute, looked directly at him, though he had hidden himself behind the structural beam, and nodded, as if she knew. That ritual spread like a quiet contagion. Soon others began drifting toward the observation deck, pretending to inspect equipment, adjust surveillance angles, or simply pass through. They said nothing. But each of them left with something they couldn't quite articulate, a sense that something larger was at play, that maybe the myths were true, that maybe they had inherited a legacy they didn't fully understand. One evening, a corporal placed a sealed envelope under the bench where she stood. When Krell found out, he had the corporal transferred to a posting in Alaska within 36 hours. The message was never opened. But the act itself was an alarm. To the untrained eye, Inez did nothing. She followed the rules. But in truth, she was reactivating the soul of a place designed to forget. Rituals, patterns, and routines weren't her enemy. They were her language. She was speaking in the base's native tongue. While Krell tried to suppress history by repeating structure, Inez was slowly rewriting the meaning behind the repetition. Her stillness was not compliance. It was resistance, and every soldier who paused long enough to feel it knew something old was waking up beneath their feet. And in that quiet, unseen awakening, Krell sensed the first tremor of collapse, not because someone fired a weapon or staged a mutiny, but because one woman had returned to the rhythm of a place built on silence and started to change its beat. The early days of training were grueling, relentless, and designed to break the unbreakable. And for Helena, every moment felt like a war not only with her surroundings, but also with the echoes of her past that resurfaced in the unforgiving silence of 4 a.m. drills. The mountain air sliced through the barracks like icy knives, and the instructors were merciless, treating every recruit as if they were already behind enemy lines. Helena didn't expect any favors, and she didn't ask for any. In fact, her stoicism unsettled the others. Where many cracked under pressure or sought out camaraderie for comfort, she remained focused, quiet, and distant. Even her bunkmates, who had started warming up to each other, whispered warily about her when they thought she wasn't listening. Rumors brewed about the tattoo that had stopped her at the gate. No one could confirm what it looked like exactly, but they all seemed to agree it had something to do with classified operations, or black ops. The stories got more dramatic by the day, from her being a ghost operative to someone who had taken down an entire insurgent cell single-handedly. Helena ignored the gossip. She had bigger things to focus on. During a particularly brutal night training exercise in the rain, their unit was ordered to navigate 3 kilometers of dense terrain with minimal visibility, no lights, and only their instincts. Helena moved like a shadow through the trees, her breathing steady, her footsteps deliberate. It was second nature to her, the wild, the dark, the need to rely on nothing but senses, but she noticed others stumbling, losing pace, misreading the map. One of them, a younger recruit named Nolan, twisted his ankle and tried to hide it. The squad was about to leave him behind, caught between the order to finish the course and the instinct not to abandon a teammate. Helena broke her silence. Without ceremony, she swung Nolan's arm over her shoulder and carried him while still moving at pace. The drill instructors saw it. Everyone saw it. She didn't do it for points or praise, she just did it. It was the first moment the unit began to see her, not just as a mystery, but as a leader. But just as she began earning respect, command began taking a closer look. Not everyone appreciated Helena's presence. Lieutenant Radcliffe, a career officer with a spotless record and an ego built on order, didn't trust what he didn't understand. He saw Helena's stoic excellence as a challenge to his authority, and he began subtly sabotaging her progress. Tasks that should have been team-based were assigned to her alone. Equipment she needed was misplaced, and during evaluations her scores were mysteriously under review. She never complained, but the pressure built like steam inside a sealed pipe. It wasn't until a security breach occurred on base, a data leak traced to a missing access badge, that things took a darker turn. The badge had last been used near the East Wing, where Helena had been seen earlier that morning. The connection was circumstantial at best, but for someone like Radcliffe, it was enough. Helena was called in for questioning, stripped of privileges temporarily, and placed under direct supervision. Most recruits would have snapped, but she remained calm, even as they combed through her background again, searching for something they could use. The truth was, they wouldn't find much. Her records were clean, well, mostly. What wasn't redacted was vague and sanitized. Honorably discharged from a joint task force, multilingual, specialist training in survival tactics, intelligence liaison. What wasn't written was the most important part. She had served in classified zones where operations had no names, and enemies wore no uniforms. The tattoo on her shoulder, partially glimpsed during medical checks, was not decorative. It was a symbol recognized only by those who had worked under the Shadow Protocol, a now defunct operation designed for deep cover missions that the military would deny ever happened. The tattoo marked survivors, not volunteers, and it came with an unspoken code of silence, so even when they pushed, even when they tried to rattle her, she gave them nothing. It wasn't pride, it was survival, but someone on base did recognize it. Sergeant Major Reyes, a combat veteran long past his prime but still sharp as a bayonet, had once crossed paths with those involved in the Shadow Protocol. He'd seen the same tattoo once, years ago, on the shoulder of a woman who'd pulled his squad out of an ambush in the dead of night. He hadn't forgotten. And when he saw Helena, he didn't see a threat. He saw a warrior. One morning after a run, Reyes approached her quietly. He didn't ask about the tattoo. He simply said, "We know who you are. Let them catch up." That was the first time Helena allowed a flicker of acknowledgement to cross her face. A nod. That was all, but it was enough to shift the tide. From that point forward, Reyes quietly advocated for her. He ensured her gear was always ready, her training logs were accurate, and her name was on lists that mattered. The others followed suit. The rumors faded, replaced by real respect. She wasn't just the woman with the forbidden ink. She was the one who carried injured men on her back, who finished drills without complaint, who never broke formation even when pushed beyond reason. Her legend was no longer shadowed in mystery. It was forged in the same fire they all endured, but with a resolve that burned brighter. And that resolve was about to be tested in ways even she hadn't prepared for. Because Helena wasn't just training to survive. She was preparing for something much bigger than herself. Something that would bring the past crashing into the present. By the time the second week rolled around, Harper had already changed the rhythm of Fort Halbridge's daily operations without even meaning to. What started as awkward tolerance had slowly shifted into cautious curiosity. Harper didn't force conversations or try to prove herself anymore. Instead, she let her actions speak, and they spoke louder than any of the radio chatter flooding the command tents or the stomping of boots during morning drills. She was first to rise, last to leave, and always the one making sure no tool was misplaced, no line forgotten, and no man or woman left behind during drills. Her attention to detail became something of a myth among the younger recruits, who began referring to her, half mockingly and half admiringly, as, quote, the ghost warden. But it wasn't respect she was after. It was belonging, and that remained as distant as ever. The officers, though civil, still kept their circle tight, and while Captain Reyes had softened slightly, he never dropped his guard. For Harper, the strain of being surrounded by people who didn't want her there weighed on her heavier than the bulletproof vest she wore daily. The walls weren't physical anymore. They were in the glances not returned, the silence when she approached a group, the extra second it took someone to hand her a tool or answer a question. She endured it like she'd endured everything else in life, quietly, with clenched teeth and eyes forward. Her only true moments of peace came in the hangar late at night, long after the rest of the base had turned in. She'd sit cross-legged under the open belly of the decommissioned Falcon-21, an old jet that hadn't flown in years, patching cables or just running her fingers over the hull like she was listening for its heartbeat. One night, while adjusting the hydraulic lines, she found an old maintenance log tucked behind a loose panel. It was handwritten, messy, full of scribbled updates and forgotten repairs from over a decade ago. As she read through it, something about the notes struck her. They weren't just technical logs. They were almost journal entries, reflections, snippets of personality behind the repairs. One line caught her breath. Don't just fix the wings. Fix what made them crash. It was signed by Sergeant Keegan, dated June 2007. She'd never heard of him, but the words settled into her like a seed. Harper began writing her own entries, not in the official logs, but in a small notebook she kept in her side pouch. Notes about the aircrafts, yes, but also thoughts about the base, the people, and her place in it. She didn't know why she did it, only that she needed to speak to someone, even if it was only a ghost through paper. The next turning point came when an electrical fault hit one of the transport helices during a routine test run. The aircraft sputtered mid-hover, veered off its path, and nearly crashed into the comms tower before stabilizing just feet from disaster. Panic flooded the base. Harper, who had been on ladder duty nearby, didn't wait for orders. She sprinted to the helipad, climbed aboard even as it hissed with static, and pulled the emergency bypass circuit manually. It wasn't protocol, and it could have backfired. But it didn't. She stopped a chain failure that could have crippled a major part of the fleet. That night, her name was mentioned in the debrief not as a footnote, but as the reason the tower was still standing. Captain Reyes didn't say thank you, but for the first time, he didn't avoid her eyes during roll call. That silence, to Harper, was louder than praise. Still, that fragile progress was nearly undone days later when word spread about her tattoo. Until then, most soldiers had assumed it was just a faded design or something personal. But during a training simulation under intense heat, Harper removed her jacket, revealing the full ink etched along her right arm and shoulder. The room went still. It wasn't the art that shocked them. It was the symbol embedded at the center, the mark of the Crimson Sector. A covert, classified unit so dangerous and secretive, most high-ranking officers pretended it didn't exist. Its members were ghosts, recruited under impossible terms, trained off-grid, and discharged without record. The stories were legend. Some believed they were myth. But Harper's tattoo wasn't myth, it was real, and now it was out. The reaction was immediate. The young cadets stared at her like she was radioactive. A few backed away entirely. Officers whispered. Even the base medic, who had always been friendly, suddenly avoided her in the mess hall. But the most surprising reaction came from General Thorne, who was visiting the base for an inspection. During a walkthrough, he caught sight of her arm and stopped mid-stride. His eyes locked onto the ink, and for the first time in Harper's career, an actual general looked at her not with disdain, but with something akin to fear. He didn't say a word, just gave a sharp nod and moved on. The next day, Harper was called into Captain Reyes's office, not to be reprimanded, but to be briefed on something new, something classified, something that, somehow, had her name on it. And in that moment, Harper understood everything was about to change again. Only this time, she wouldn't be fighting for a place. She'd be fighting for something much bigger. The morning after the failed access attempt, Nora awoke with a restless weight pressing on her chest. The events of the previous day had not faded with sleep. They had only sharpened. Her dreams had been filled with cold glares, blaring alarms, and the cold echo of boots on metal floors. The security checkpoint, the dismissive voice of the gate sergeant, and the word unauthorized haunted her like a drumbeat. But she didn't wake up defeated. She woke up determined. She stared at the cracked ceiling of the modest guest house she'd rented on the outskirts of Feldmere and reminded herself of why she came. It wasn't for recognition, it wasn't for revenge, it was for her father. For the legacy that still pulsed beneath her skin, etched into her shoulder in ink that no one at that base had the clearance or courage to understand. Her plan needed revising, but her purpose had not changed. As she sat up, the stiff sheets rustling beneath her, Nora began sketching a new strategy in her mind. The base had denied her official entry, yes. But not everyone on that base operated by the book. There was one name she remembered, one person her father had spoken of years ago, someone who might still be stationed at Feldmere, or at least have connections there. Commander Eli Bannon. Her father had always described him as the rare kind of soldier who didn't just follow orders blindly. He was principled, skeptical, and fiercely loyal to those he believed in. If there was anyone who would recognize the symbol on her arm and the name she carried, it would be Bannon. She had no idea if he was still active, let alone posted nearby, but it was a start. Nora packed quickly, throwing her essentials into a backpack and tucking a copy of her father's last deployment log into the side pocket. She would need every breadcrumb, every sliver of proof to gain traction. Her fingers grazed the edge of the folded uniform she kept at the bottom of her bag. Not hers, but her father's, with the now faded insignia of the Phoenix Division stitched into the collar. She let it stay there, as both a reminder and a silent promise. By noon, she was standing in front of the Veterans Registry office in downtown Feldmere. The squat concrete building was tucked between a shuttered diner and a pawn shop, and its faded paint and buzzing neon signs suggested it hadn't seen much renovation in decades. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of old paper and rusting metal. She approached the desk, greeted by a clerk who looked more interested in his crossword than her presence. Singmusword. When she asked about Commander Bannon, the clerk raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. Instead, he tapped a few keys, frowned at the screen, and finally handed her a printed contact card with a scribbled address. Retired last year. Lives just north of the valley. This is all I got, he muttered without looking up again. The ride to Bannon's property was quiet, the road winding through thick woods and low, fog-kissed hills. Nora drove a borrowed motorcycle, weaving between potholes and tree roots as the forest thickened. Finally, just as the sun began to dip behind the horizon, she saw it, a modest cabin tucked between tall pines, smoke curling from a crooked chimney. She parked at the edge of the gravel path and walked the rest of the way, heart thumping with nerves. What if he didn't remember her father? What if he refused to help? What if he too was one of those who feared the ink she bore? The man who opened the door was older than she expected, but still formidable. He stood tall, shoulders squared with a presence that suggested his authority had never truly left him. His face was marked by years of command, lines etched deep at the corners of his eyes, a jaw that seemed carved from stone. But when he looked at her, there was a flicker of recognition, not in who she was, but in something else, something deeper. "You're Dominic Ellery's daughter," he said, not asked, just stated, as if the truth of it had hit him the moment she stepped onto the porch. Nora exhaled, the first real breath she'd taken in days. Inside, the cabin was warm and cluttered, filled with military memorabilia, old maps, and framed black-and-white photographs of men in uniform. Nora sat on a stiff couch while Bannon brewed coffee, the silence between them charged with memory. When he returned, she rolled up her sleeve and revealed the tattoo. The moment he saw it, he stopped mid-step. His eyes locked onto the emblem, and his hand trembled slightly. "They told us it was gone," he muttered. "They told us it was dismantled, erased." She told him everything, how her father had never spoken much about the Phoenix Division after his forced retirement, how he'd spent years in silence, then suddenly left one morning with only a cryptic note and a warning to stay away from the base. She told him about her search, the refusals, the silence, and finally, the gate. When she finished, Bannon leaned back, looking not at her but at some distant ghost in the corner of the room. "What they told the world," he said finally, "was only part of the story. Phoenix wasn't just a black ops unit. It was a shield and a threat. What you carry, that mark, it means something to people still in power, and it scares the hell out of them." His voice dropped low as he leaned in. "And if you're serious about finding out what really happened to your father, you're going to need more than clearance. You're going to need allies. And fast." For the first time since she'd arrived in Feldmere, Nora felt the tide shift. She wasn't alone anymore. She had a name, a history, and now, perhaps, the beginning of an answer. Bannon's presence, his quiet but certain decision to stand beside her, was the first crack in the wall of resistance she'd been facing since the moment she arrived. The real story was no longer buried. It was waiting to rise. And with Bannon's help, she might just unearth it. An uneasy silence stretched across the small interrogation chamber, the only sounds being the quiet hum of the fluorescent lights above and the occasional shuffle of boots from the hallway beyond. General Kessler leaned forward slowly, folding his gloved hands atop the steel table, his posture calm but watchful, like a lion ready to pounce if provoked. Across from him sat Sira, her gaze steady, expression unreadable, posture straight despite the invisible weight pressing down on her shoulders. The general's voice finally broke the quiet, deep and calculated, asking not a question but a challenge masked in inquiry. He wanted to know how she had come to possess knowledge classified beyond top secret, information encrypted, buried, and, in some cases, even erased from the historical record. Sira offered no immediate answer. Instead, her eyes drifted momentarily to the surveillance camera in the corner of the room, its red light blinking like a heartbeat, recording every breath, every word, every flicker of emotion. They wanted her story, but only in a way that fit their framework, their chain of command, their idea of who had the right to know and who didn't. But Sira had never fit in any of their boxes, and she certainly wasn't about to start now. She began with a quiet statement, one that made General Kessler's brow twitch just slightly. She told him she wasn't alone, not now, not ever, not in spirit, and not in mission. She described a network of people the general had long believed either defected, retired, or disappeared. People who had gone underground when the systems they served betrayed the very principles they had sworn to protect. These weren't just rebels or whistleblowers. These were former operatives, scholars, cryptographers, medics, and even former military leaders, each with a different specialty, each united by a single purpose: safeguarding truth. She painted the picture carefully, never revealing locations, never giving full names, but providing just enough to rattle the rigid structure of authority Kessler held onto so tightly. She told him how the tattoo he had seen, the one that made him pause, that sent a whisper down the entire chain of command, wasn't just an inked emblem of rebellion. It was a badge of sacrifice, of survival, of a vow made in blood and silence to never again allow the manipulation of memory and power to go unchecked. General Kessler's expression remained still, but something shifted in the way he breathed, a faint change in rhythm. He remembered that symbol. Years ago, when he was still a young lieutenant, he had seen it once, on the shoulder of a man whose name had been redacted from every file after a failed operation in the Albion sector. That man had reportedly died in a classified incident, but rumors persisted among the old guard that he hadn't died. He had vanished. And now, decades later, that same symbol appeared again, not in whispers or ancient photos, but tattooed boldly on the arm of a young woman who looked like she should be filing papers in a lab rather than sitting at the heart of a national security enigma. Kessler asked her one question. Just one. He leaned forward and said, "Who trained you?" The silence after the question lasted almost a full minute. Sierra held his gaze and responded with something that wasn't a name, but a phrase, one so old and nearly forgotten that it sent a cold shiver down Kessler's back. From shadow to shield, from silence to light. It was the motto of Project Lysander, an initiative believed to have been disbanded decades ago after a controversial internal purge. But Kessler now realized, disbanded didn't mean destroyed, it meant hidden. The general stood without another word and walked to the door, where two security officers flanked either side. He ordered them to stand down. Whatever this girl had done, she was no longer a prisoner. She was a variable, a thread tangled into a much older tapestry, one he now had to approach with caution. Kessler didn't like uncertainty, but he knew when to yield to the weight of history. Sierra was escorted not to a holding cell, but to a secure conference room with no windows and no recording devices. She was given water, fresh clothing, in the presence of three other ranking officers whose faces she scanned quietly. One of them she recognized, a woman named Linares, who had vanished during the Avalon uprising. Their eyes met, and in that brief exchange, a silent confirmation passed between them. They were no longer ghosts. They were awakening. Sarah was told that an emergency session of the Strategic Command Council was being arranged, not because she was a threat, but because she had disrupted a carefully maintained illusion, and illusions, once cracked, were hard to keep whole. Meanwhile, word spread quietly through the base. From cafeteria workers to junior officers, whispers moved faster than official memos. The girl, with the forbidden tattoo. The one who walked in defiance and left protocol in her dust. Some believed she was a plant, others a myth. A few even thought she was an omen. But none could deny the ripple she had caused. Somewhere deeper in the compound, behind walls no one without Omega-level clearance had ever crossed, old data cores flickered back to life. Archived files long since scrubbed began populating hidden drives. Sierra's arrival had triggered something, a signal embedded in the system by those long gone, awakened only by specific biometric markers. And Sierra, without knowing it, had matched them all. The moment she stepped into that room, she wasn't just the girl with a mysterious tattoo anymore. She was a key, a bridge between what had been buried and what could no longer stay hidden. And the people watching her, fearing her, studying her, they knew they couldn't stop what was coming. They could only decide which side they wanted to be on when the tide turned. Maya didn't need to look over her shoulder to feel the shift. Every step she took on the concrete path toward the officer's compound echoed with the weight of a past she had once run from, but now she was walking right back into its heart. The base, once a symbol of pain and rejection, had transformed into the stage where her truth demanded to be seen. Her boots thudded with authority, and the glint of the metal badge on her chest no longer felt like borrowed honor. It was hers, earned, burned into her through scars, fire, and resilience. As she approached the high-security doors, an uneasy hush seemed to ripple through the courtyard. Conversations dropped mid-sentence. Soldiers turned their heads, recognizing her not just by her face, but by the unmistakable tattoo that peeked out from beneath her uniform's collar. Now, no longer hidden, no longer a secret. It was the very same symbol that had caused the brass to panic years ago, yet now it radiated power rather than threat. It was the legacy she carried from her mother's lineage, a mark of ancient warrior blood, one that had once challenged empires and survived purges. Inside the operations building, Commander Wallace stood stiffly with a few high-ranking officers who had just arrived. Their murmurs ceased the moment they noticed Maya enter. Her presence no longer required introduction. Her reputation had not only preceded her, it had rewritten the very fabric of the base's folklore. She stepped forward and presented the official documents from HQ clearance. Authorization, recognition, her orders were final. She had been reassigned here, not as a favor, not as a formality, but as a strategic decision born from necessity. The same brass who once called her unstable were now calling her indispensable. Wallace's jaw tightened, eyes flickering with a mix of irritation and reluctant admiration. He scanned the orders and looked up with a sigh, knowing he couldn't override what had been decided at a level even he dared not question. Maya offered no gloating, no smugness, only silence and purpose. She had not returned to prove herself. She had returned to do what she had always wanted, to serve, to protect, and to do it her way. News of Maya's reinstatement spread like wildfire, but it wasn't the paperwork or the rank on her shoulder that shocked the soldiers. It was the chilling whisper of the story that had followed her like a shadow. The story of what had happened during the ambush in Hadura, of the way she had escaped, of the terrifying efficiency with which she had dismantled a fully armed insurgent unit with her bare hands, and of how the enemy had reportedly begged for surrender not to the army, but to the marked woman with the silent eyes. They didn't know all the facts. They didn't need to. What they had were fragments of truth laced with legend, and that was often more powerful than reality. Maya walked the halls with an air of quiet detachment. Not aloofness, but precision. Every movement was measured, every response disciplined. She refused to be pulled into gossip or praise. She had work to do, and distractions, positive or negative, had no place in her mission. Despite the formal tension, something strange began to shift. Younger soldiers began to gravitate toward her presence during training drills. Recruits approached her for guidance, mimicking her posture, asking for tips in the most respectful way. Even some of the senior sergeants who had once scoffed at her now observed her with curiosity. There was something magnetic about the way she moved through exercises, not just with skill, but with intention. Her past was no longer being held against her. In some ways, it had become the very thing that inspired those around her. Maya noticed it, but she didn't react. Not outwardly. She trained. She watched. And slowly, she started to rebuild. She offered mentorship to a few who reminded her of the younger version of herself, fiery, uncertain, eager. She challenged them, pushed them, never gave easy compliments. But when she gave one, it landed like a thunderclap. Meanwhile, an intelligence alert had been triggered about a rogue faction operating near the mountain ranges adjacent to the base, an area thought to be secure. Maya, who had spent time surviving in similar terrains, offered to lead the recon. Wallace, backed into a corner of protocol, had no choice but to approve it. He wanted to protest, but the undeniable truth was clear. There was no one better suited to track, analyze, and anticipate what was happening out there. Maya assembled a lean team of scouts, hand-picking individuals she trusted or had trained personally over the past few weeks. These were not the most decorated, but they were sharp, focused, and understood the mission. Clarity, not chaos. The night before the recon, Maya stood alone at the edge of the base, overlooking the vast wilderness that awaited them. The wind was sharp, carrying the faint howls of jackals and the rustling of unseen movements. She felt no fear, she felt alignment. What lay ahead might be dangerous, yes, but it was her domain now. Not because she had claimed it, but because she had earned it. Through blood, through betrayal, through growth. She remembered her mother's voice, not in words, but in rhythm. The rhythm of endurance, the rhythm of truth, and above all, the rhythm of return. Maya had returned, not just to the base, but to herself. The silence in the hall after the explosion of Ilara's past was deafening, and the weight of what had just been shared seemed to press down on every corner of the room. For the first time, there were no murmurs, no hidden whispers, no veiled judgments. Instead, there was only breath held in collective realization, a dawning sense that everything they had assumed about her, her presence, her motivations, her authority, had been grossly underestimated. Commander Harrow, who had so often been the immovable object in every conversation, now looked at her not with suspicion, but with a deep, rooted respect that could only come from seeing someone's full truth laid bare. The tattoo that had once been dismissed as a meaningless symbol now burned in everyone's memory as something almost sacred, a visual representation of pain endured, honor earned, and purpose reclaimed. But for Alara, the real battle hadn't been won in that conference room. That room had only been the beginning. Following the events of that fateful meeting, something strange began to happen within the command structure of Base Halberd. Orders that had previously been questioned when filtered through Alara's name were now executed with urgency. Briefings that had once excluded her now seemed incomplete without her input, and yet, for all the newfound recognition, Alara felt a kind of quiet distance settling within her. Not isolation, not loneliness, something else, a sharpening of purpose, a knowing that she was now not only seen, but looked to. She no longer needed to demand her place. It had been carved through fire, and now all eyes turned toward her for the next move. It didn't take long for the next test to arrive. Word reached the base that a diplomatic envoy from a neutral planet, Suradin, had gone dark, just past the perimeter of an unstable sector known for sudden gravitational shifts and communication blackouts. Suradin was not an official ally, but its support had kept multiple trade corridors open between Earth colonies and the outer rings. Losing their trust would set off a domino effect of political unraveling. High Command debated for hours, some arguing that a rescue was too risky, others pushing for a wait-and-see approach. Alara, listening quietly, finally stood and said the words that shifted the tone of the room entirely. "We go in tonight." There were no protests. Only silent acknowledgement that her judgment had earned this level of immediate action. As the strike rescue unit mobilized, Alara found herself walking alongside Lieutenant Kellen, now her unofficial second-in-command. His skepticism had long been replaced with quiet admiration, but tonight, even he seemed uneasy. "You realize they might be walking into a trap," he muttered, adjusting his gear as they prepped by the transport vessel. Alara nodded, her expression steady. "I know, but we owe them that risk. People remember who shows up in the silence." It wasn't bravado. It was conviction, laced with the kind of empathy that comes from having once been abandoned in the shadows herself. That same night, as the team descended into the volatile region, everything began to unfold with eerie precision until it didn't. Midway through the extraction, the atmosphere began to pulse unnaturally. A seismic tremor rattled the ground, and suddenly communication with the outer perimeter of the mission team broke off. The small crew that had remained aboard the shuttle lost visual confirmation of the rescue unit entirely. Panic threatened to rise. Some commanders called for retreat. But Alara, sitting stone still at the ops table, reached for the coordinates of a secondary route, the one no one ever used because it was partially submerged in residual debris from an old meteor storm. She punched in the override and took manual control. "I'll get them out," she said, not waiting for permission. Alara led a skeleton crew through what should have been an impassable corridor, trusting nothing but her instincts, her training, and a gut feeling honed over years of crawling through more impossible landscapes. She moved not just with strategy, but with memory, every fallen comrade, every failed mission she had once survived through sheer willpower, acting as silent guardians over her choices. And it worked. After nearly 2 hours of weaving through collapsing terrain, they reached the envoy, bruised, dehydrated, but alive. Her team, against the odds, was intact. And so was the fragile alliance with Suradin, which would later issue a private commendation for The leadership that arrived when logic said retreat. When Alara returned, she didn't walk into base halberd, she was saluted into it. Generals who had once ignored her existence now stood, not just out of protocol, but in acknowledgement of someone whose presence had become synonymous with action, clarity, and sacrifice. The symbol on her neck, once hidden behind the collar of her uniform, was now unobstructed. It was no longer just her past. It was a mark that others began to whisper about, not with fear, but with reverence. And the name that once triggered dismissive shrugs now moved through halls with weight, Alara Voss. Yet despite all this, she remained grounded. She didn't hunger for the spotlight. She didn't begin requesting special quarters or privileges. Instead, she asked for better armor for the lower-ranking medics. She fought for additional leave for overworked pilots. She mentored cadets who reminded her of herself, driven but discounted. And quietly, within the sanctum of her own quarters, she began compiling something else, a private dossier of those like her. Not just the elite soldiers who bore the tattoo, but the ones who had walked through unthinkable fire, who had fought wars no one documented, and who carried their purpose like a living, breathing vow. Alara's mission was no longer about proving herself. That part was done. Now it was about building something that would outlast her, something that would ensure no one with worth would ever again be blocked by the blindness of rank or the arrogance of gatekeepers. The tattoo had become a symbol within the base, but for Alara, it was simply the beginning of a legacy written not on skin, but in the way lives were protected, paths were opened, and stories were finally told. Evening crept in like a silent observer, watching as Avery walked with quiet purpose across the courtyard that connected the Eastern Training Complex to the Operations Command Hub. The compound, now half-lit by the soft glow of floodlights and the distant flicker of surveillance towers, seemed far less imposing than it had days ago. There was a shift in the energy around her, subtle but unmistakable. Where once there had been suspicion and silence, now there was curiosity, whispered reverence, and more than a few cautious nods from those she passed. Avery had become something of a mythic figure in only a matter of days, and while she had no interest in feeding the rumor mill, she could not ignore the weight of the eyes that now followed her steps. Inside, she was still processing the cryptic mission packet left on her cot that morning, sealed in a matte black folder with her name handwritten in firm, military cursive. No insignia, no sender, just one line of typed instructions. Report to Observation Room 6C at 1900 hours. Dress tactical, no questions asked. The protocol screamed Black Ops, and she was used to that, just not from them. The base leadership had shifted since General Vortan's heated departure. Colonel Rice, a quiet but tactical-minded man with a deep respect for old traditions, had stepped into a role he never intended to fill. He was among the few who hadn't outright challenged Avery's presence upon her arrival. If anything, he had seemed wary but open-minded, like a man walking through fog with a compass, but no map. The envelope hadn't come from him, but Avery suspected he had knowledge of it, possibly even approved it. When she stepped into Room 6C, she expected darkness, secrecy, perhaps a dim-lit holographic table, and silent masked men like in the old intel briefings of her past. What she found instead were three familiar faces and a fourth that made her breath catch, not from fear, but from an old memory slamming into her with the force of a detonation. Major Lang stood to the side, arms crossed, face taut, with a mix of hesitation and resolve. Beside him, Captain Sorrell adjusted his gloves nervously, the same gloves he had worn during recon operations in Cordova, where she'd first met him under hostile fire and desert winds. Then there was Dr. Helena Mirkov, the base's chief psychological analyst, and probably the only one here who truly saw beneath the surface of those she evaluated. But it was the fourth figure, tall, silver-haired, with a deep scar running across his jaw, that pulled the oxygen from Avery's lungs, General Ronan Vortan. Not an image on a screen, Not a ghost in a memory. The man himself, in full dress uniform, standing like a marble statue with eyes sharp as knives. Avery didn't speak. Neither did he. For a moment, the room was a vacuum. Time did not move. Then he nodded once, sharply, and gestured toward the central table where a set of encrypted files flickered to life. Mirkov broke the silence first. "This mission isn't sanctioned by traditional command," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "But it's been quietly greenlit by the Strategic Advisory Network. Think of it as a fire we can't admit exists, but desperately need to put out." Sorel chimed in, shifting uncomfortably. "A covert facility in North Tazran went dark 6 days ago. No signals in or out. Satellite feeds show heat anomalies consistent with rapid evac and something non-human moving near the perimeter 2 days ago." Avery processed it in seconds. A lab, unauthorized experiments, likely a containment failure. And if they were calling her in, "You want me to lead the sweep," she said, not a question. Vortan finally spoke, and his voice had not changed. Still gravel and steel. "Not just lead it, neutralize it. We tried sending drones. All lost signal. The last 2 squads, gone without a trace." He paused, his gaze steady. "This isn't just about recovery. It's about extinction." She noticed then that they'd brought her a specialized gear set, tactical, but with modifications she hadn't seen in years. Pulse-modulated blades, sound-dampening armor, biofeedback patches linked to remote AI diagnostic hubs. Someone had invested in her survival. That, more than anything, unsettled her. She turned to Vortan, her voice clipped. "And why you? Why now?" He held her gaze, unflinching. "Because you carry something none of us do. Not just the tattoo, not just your record, but the ability to do what needs to be done, even if it means you won't be celebrated for it. The kind of soldier we tried to make but failed every time. Except once." There it was. The admission he could never say before. Avery didn't flinch. "When do we leave?" 0500. "Stealth transport. Team of 5. You lead." She nodded. There was no thrill, no fear, just a mounting sense of inevitability. This wasn't a call to glory. It was a call to finish what others had botched. To walk into a shadow and either return with answers or not return at all. That night, Avery sat on the roof of the South Barracks and watched the stars. Not for inspiration, not for comfort, but to remind herself that the world, for all its madness, was still turning. And in a few hours, she'd step into a place where it very well might stop. She reached into her vest pocket and touched the edge of her dog tag, the one that had never been registered in any database, the one only one other person had ever seen, and feared. Beneath her collar, the edges of the tattoo pulsed faintly, glowing not with light, but memory. The past wasn't done with her, and now, neither was the future. The storm outside had gathered with a kind of ominous presence that seemed to reflect the quiet turmoil swelling inside the war room of Sector 9. Rain lashed against the windows as Colonel Everett stood beside Dr. Solene Miles, neither of them speaking for a long moment after the footage played its final frame. The grainy, classified video showing a much younger Solene stepping between 2 warlords in the Thuraz Desert, arms raised and spine unbending, had left even seasoned officers like Everett visibly shaken. They had all heard stories of what she'd done that day, how she'd negotiated the release of 27 hostages without firing a single bullet, but seeing the raw magnetism she radiated even under duress was something entirely different. It was then that the colonel leaned in, lowered his voice and said, "They're not going to like what comes next." Solene didn't flinch. "They never do," she replied quietly. Word of her reinstatement, unofficial as it still was, had begun to ripple through the compound. Whispers turned to murmurs, and murmurs turned to silent salutes as she walked the halls again, not as a ghost this time, but as a force. Her presence cut through the tension like the thunder that rolled overhead, especially among those who remembered her from the field. Those younger, newer recruits who hadn't known her legacy began to see it manifest in real time. She corrected mistakes in their operations layouts without raising her voice. She offered insight into terrain behavior, negotiation sequences, and psycho-ops that stunned analysts into silence. She did not demand authority. She simply was authority, and the smart ones could feel it in their bones. But not everyone welcomed her return. General Thorne had kept to the shadows, watching from afar, avoiding confrontation. Despite the board's reluctant acquiescence, his pride remained a festering wound. He gathered those loyal to him, men and women who owed their promotions to his empire of bureaucracy, and instructed them to dig into her past. Dig into her medical records. Dig into the real reason she left 10 years ago. They didn't have to look far. One of Thorne's aides uncovered a sealed file from a psychiatric evaluation dated 9 years ago. It described a period of emotional instability following a failed extraction in Albania, during which Soline had allegedly gone silent for 72 hours, disappearing off-grid before reappearing with all 5 of her team members alive but badly wounded. The therapist noted signs of PTSD, potential recklessness, and non-compliance with post-field protocol. Thorne was sure he had her. He leaked it. Quietly, strategically. A folder on a bench. A screenshot on a forgotten flash drive. Within hours, questions circulated. Could she be trusted? Had her brilliance come at the cost of her sanity? The following morning, she walked into the situation briefing, the whispers nearly audible as a heartbeat. Thorne sat at the head of the table, smug and watchful, waiting for her to crack. But she didn't. Instead, she placed her own file, one she had prepared for this very moment, at the center of the table, a transcript of her psychological clearance. Testimonials from the very soldiers she had saved in Albania. One had written, "She didn't vanish. She carried us on her back through frostbite and sniper fire. She gave up her jacket, her food, her sleep. If that's instability, I hope we all catch it." The room was silent when she finished reading. Then, slowly, Colonel Everett clapped. Not sarcastically, not defiantly, but with the weight of someone who had finally seen truth beat rumor. Others followed. Even those unsure began to shift, their posture loosening, their expressions neutralizing. Thorne's grip on the room was unraveling, but Soline wasn't interested in vindication for its own sake. She had other concerns. The intelligence regarding Operation Glass River had taken a troubling turn. Satellite imagery showed unexpected movement near the border of Kandar. A rogue faction rumored to have access to electromagnetic pulse technology had begun constructing something in the northern crags. The terrain was brutal, nearly impassable by vehicles, and traditional air support was a gamble in those weather conditions. They needed someone who could lead a team through it undetected, negotiate if possible, engage if not. Soline volunteered. There was hesitation, still, the echo of old doubts, but the truth was clear. There was no one better equipped. She began assembling her team, selecting not the most decorated, but the most adaptable, men and women with fractured resumes and sharp instincts. She chose those who had failed once but learned, those whose records bore the marks of real battle, not just polished ceremony. Colonel Everett briefed them in private. "This mission doesn't just determine your success in the field," he said. "It determines whether our institution can evolve, whether it can still recognize value when it doesn't wear brass." As preparations ramped up, Soline returned to the barracks where she had once trained. On the inside of her left wrist was the tattoo that had once made a captain fall silent mid-sentence. An old symbol, blackened by age, that even generals feared, not because of what it meant, but because of what it reminded them, that the system they upheld had once cast aside its best. A cadet, bold and fresh-eyed, approached her one evening. "Ma'am, I heard they tried to bury your story, but you're still here." She smiled, not bitterly, but with quiet resolve. "They did, and I let them, for a while. But the truth doesn't stay buried, it always leaves a mark." As the storm eased and the skies began to clear, the countdown to Operation Glass River began. But Solene wasn't thinking about weather or weaponry. She was thinking about legacy. The kind that wasn't carved into metals, but into minds. The kind that told the next generation that even when the gates are shut and the walls close in, if your truth is stronger than your fear, you walk forward anyway. Dawn broke over the mountains in hues of orange and pale gold as Kiera stood alone on the tarmac of Fort Lyman's restricted airfield. A frigid wind whipped her hair across her face, the silence around her broken only by the distant hum of turbines warming up. Behind her, the base's perimeter tower cast a long shadow across the ground, and in that quiet moment, the weight of everything she had endured came crashing down all at once. She wasn't just a woman in uniform anymore, she was the embodiment of a storm that refused to be stilled, the survivor of an invisible war most would never even glimpse. The war hadn't been fought with guns or drones. It had been a war of identity, trust, honor, and betrayal. And Kiera had stood tall through every battle, some of which had nearly broken her. But not today, not now. This morning would mark the beginning of a new war, one that no longer sought to prove her worth, but to shape the very institution that had once cast her aside. When General Rourke arrived at the tarmac, his step was heavier than usual. The hardened man who had once scoffed at the idea of her inclusion in the Special Operations Training Program now approached her not with skepticism, but with awe, the kind reserved for legends. He didn't say much, just a firm nod. But that gesture, coming from a man who had spent decades leading the most elite units in the nation, spoke louder than any speech he could have delivered. Kiera acknowledged it with a quiet nod of her own before turning toward the waiting hangar, where inside a briefing awaited that would change the lives of dozens of new recruits, and maybe even the next generation of military leadership. Inside the Operations Command Center, her footsteps echoed across the newly polished floor, yet none dared speak as she entered, not because they feared her, but because they respected her. Her name was no longer followed by whispers of doubt, but spoken with reverence, even among those who had once campaigned against her. Seated at the front, Director Hensley from Homeland Strategic Command stood up the moment he saw her, extending a hand. "Major Kiera Vance," he said with a clear voice, "welcome back to the command." She accepted the handshake, locking eyes with him not in deference, but as equals. The rows of personnel seated behind Hensley shifted uncomfortably, clearly aware that the woman before them now wielded not only tactical expertise, but moral authority. A seat had been reserved for her at the front of the panel, not in the corner, not behind a screen, right in the center, beside the decorated generals and strategy architects. The discussion ahead would cover the restructuring of inclusion policies within elite tactical operations, an initiative that had started from the very fallout of her prior expulsion. But as the session began, Kiera realized this was more than a bureaucratic gesture. She had become the symbol they needed and feared. With each slide presented, each statistic unveiled about discriminatory practices and talent lost due to bias, the room grew heavier with the weight of its own conscience. Kiera remained composed, offering sharp insights and field-level realities the others simply hadn't experienced. She spoke of operations where female medics had made life-saving decisions under fire, of intelligence officers who had been passed over for leadership simply because their presence was too much for male subordinates, and of her own battles, both on foreign soil and within the concrete walls of Fort Lyman. But then, something unexpected happened. Colonel Anders, one of her most vocal critics from years prior, stood to speak. His voice cracked slightly as he began. "When I saw that tattoo during that first inquiry, I dismissed it as a statement. I didn't understand what it represented. I didn't understand her. But now, I do. That tattoo wasn't ink. It was a scar worn proudly, a story told without words. The room was silent as he turned toward Kiera, and I think it's time we listened more closely to those stories instead of trying to silence them. The ripple of nods that followed wasn't dramatic, but it was powerful. The tides had finally turned, not just for Kiera, but for the hundreds of others who had remained invisible behind her. Later that afternoon, Kiera walked the halls of the training facility, the very same corridors where she had once been taunted, ignored, doubted. But now, young recruits looked at her with eyes full of admiration, not just for her rank, but for her resilience. One young female cadet, no older than 20, stepped forward hesitantly. "Ma'am," she said, her voice almost breaking, "I was told people like me wouldn't last here, but because of you, I'm still standing. Thank you." Kiera smiled, the kind of smile that carried 1,000 sleepless nights and 100 battles fought in silence. She placed a hand on the cadet's shoulder and said nothing, because sometimes no words could capture the gravity of a moment like that. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the ridge and the facility's lights flickered to life, Kiera sat alone on the rooftop of the barracks, overlooking the sprawling base. The tattoo on her shoulder, long healed but forever striking, peeked out from under her uniform. It wasn't just a symbol of her past anymore. It was a warning to those who underestimated what strength could look like. And a reminder that, even in the most fortified institutions, change could be sparked by a single person willing to stand when everyone else demanded they kneel. The sun had long set by the time they reached the summit of Mount Eldrin, a place known less for its altitude and more for its brutal winds and the echoing quiet that felt both haunting and sacred. Ava stood at the peak with Thorn, Eli, Commander Boris, and a few others who had quietly joined them on the journey. The climb had been metaphorical and literal, testing every muscle, belief, and buried trauma within them. Ava's breath was visible in the cold air, but her heart beat steadily, warmed not just by exertion, but by something deeper, an understanding, a sense of closure, and the dawning presence of something new, something waiting to unfold. She placed the last of the memorial markers into the frost-hardened soil, a small obsidian disc with intricate carvings of the Unity sigil. She did not cry. She didn't need to anymore. Her body, mind, and spirit had already wept all that was necessary, and what remained now was a sacred silence. The others bowed their heads, not in religious reverence, but in shared respect. This was where the old story ended, and this is where the new one quietly began. Days later, the base was different, not because of policy or new leadership, though those had shifted too, but because something fundamental had changed in its very energy. There was less fear in the air, less hierarchy for the sake of control, and more open stares, nods of acknowledgement, and voices daring to ask questions. The younger cadets began to whisper her name with awe and curiosity. "The woman with the tattoo," they'd say. But by then, Ava had outgrown the shadow of myth. She didn't need the legend anymore. She had become more than it. The generals who had once bristled at her presence were now slower to judge and quicker to listen. Some of them had even quietly asked to speak with her, not about power, not about strategy, but about meaning, about what they'd lost somewhere along the path of command. One of them, General Evren, known for his rigidity and bite, asked to walk the perimeter with her one dusk. They didn't speak much, but when they reached the overlook where the sunset spilled into the valley like liquid fire, he simply said, "I forgot what this felt like." And she understood. Eli had returned to his unit, but something in him had shifted permanently. He no longer moved as a man hiding in his own skin. He carried his pain with dignity now, like a worn but sharpened tool. He often looked over at Ava from across the training grounds with something between a smile and a nod, a silent thank you that never needed words. Thorn, ever Ava's storm-eyed partner in silence, had taken up a new position training trauma response teams for critical missions. He and Ava shared late-night tea under the stars on occasion. where nothing had to be said, and yet everything was understood. As for Commander Barras, she resumed her post with a humility that came from staring directly into her own failings and not looking away. She publicly backed Ava in the formation of the Unity Initiative, a voluntary mentorship and recovery program focused on mental resilience, inter-unit healing, and legacy beyond the battlefield. Ava didn't lead it in title. She didn't need to. Her presence, her example, was the lifeblood of the entire thing. New recruits were shown her story on their first week, not as propaganda, but as a humanizing truth. They were taught about loss, about leadership with empathy, about strength that didn't require brutality. Ava's tattoo became a symbol, not of fear, but of reverence. Still, when she passed certain corridors, some veterans instinctively stiffened, unsure whether to salute, bow, or turn away. She would meet their confusion with a small nod or a glance that disarmed and invited. In that way, the healing continued in small but persistent ripples. Years later, on the anniversary of the Unity Reformation, Ava stood again on the base's central dais, now open air, surrounded by blossoming blue thistles, her favorite, and a crowd of soldiers, officers, and civilians alike. Her hair was streaked with silver now, and lines marked the corners of her eyes, not from age alone, but from witnessing. She did not wear medals. She wore a simple tunic, and as she lifted her arm and rolled up the sleeve, revealing the tattoo in its full majesty, there was a collective inhale. Not of fear, not anymore, but of awe. And maybe, of love. She spoke not about war or glory, but about choice, about choosing to return, to stay, to rebuild, to forgive. She ended not with a demand or a declaration, but with a story about the boy who fell into the ice and never came back, about the girl who never forgot him, and the woman who chose to let him live through her, not as a ghost, but as a guiding flame. There was silence when she finished. Then, applause. Then tears. Then a quiet stillness that meant the message had landed where it was meant to. In the years that followed, Ava became something of a legend. Yes, but not the kind that fades into static history. She became the kind people referenced when making choices, when standing at crossroads, when deciding between cruelty and compassion. She became the story whispered from mentor to cadet, from mother to child, from friend to grieving friend. They remembered her not for the pain she survived, but for the strength with which she transformed it. And as the sun set on yet another chapter of her life, Ava found peace not in what she had accomplished, but in who she had become. Not a warrior, not a martyr, not even a hero, just someone who stayed, someone who chose, someone who healed. And for those who followed, that was enough. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.